I'll start the session. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining and watching today's session. My name is Shanika, and I am your session coordinator for today. And we are very grateful to have Lindsay here with us to speak about her journey into the legal field and her career as a criminal defense lawyer at Daniel Brown Law. I'm sure many of you will find this session with Lindsay to be incredibly insightful and interesting. Now I'll pass it on to you, Lindsay, to introduce yourself.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, Shanika. Like I said, when we were chatting before, I think this is a really phenomenal program. I wish something like this existed when I was an undergrad. I think it would have been helpful just to hear from various lawyers across different disciplines. So I think it's really valuable. And I encourage everyone to go to as many of these as you can, just because it's really instructive learning about what other lawyers actually do. Sometimes that can be a little bit opaque. So thanks so much for having me. As Shanika mentioned, I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I'm a partner at a firm called Daniel Brown Law in Toronto. We handle sort of all different types of criminal matters. I happen to handle a lot of sexual offense prosecutions. Our firm sort of has an expertise in that area. That said, we handle a lot of different types of cases. Typically, we tend to take on cases that have serious sort of reputational consequences for our clients and sort of more serious allegations. In terms of what my practice looks like I said, a lot of sexual offense prosecutions, but last year I did, I did a murder trial, I did a fail to remain causing death case. So it's sort of all over the place in terms of the different types of cases that we do. I've been a lawyer for how long? 6 years. I was called to the bar in 2016. And I know there's sort of some specific questions, Shanika, that you're going to ask. So maybe I'll just stop it there.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, thank you for that introduction. It was very well said. So I'd like to begin by asking you about your undergraduate experience. So I understand you went to Queen's University for English language and literature as well as French studies.
Yes.
So could you explain your decision to go to Queen's for English for your undergraduate, and how do you believe this benefited you in your journey into the legal field?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I took English just because I loved it. That's something that was always interesting to me. I didn't necessarily know what my path was going to be. I didn't know that I was going to go to law school for sure. It was something that was sort of in the back of my mind as a possibility, but it's certainly not something that I was actively preparing for when I was applying to undergrad. And so I loved English. That's what I wanted to take. That's what I applied everywhere for. Sorry, that's my dog. Hopefully that's my dog. Hopefully that's not too disruptive. In terms of picking programs for study, so I was a French immersion student, so I wanted to make sure to continue my French. That's one of the reasons I pursued French studies as a minor, just to sort of keep my options open. I thought second language acquisition was really important. Sorry, my dog is just going crazy in the background. This is what you get when you work from home sometimes. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me.
I don't really hear your dog, but I mean, he's glad to join us if he can.
No, she's going to be in trouble now. Sorry. So going back to English. So I thought actually it was a really excellent way to prepare for law school, more so than other programs that might have covered sort of substantive material that might have been relevant for law school. So a lot of people take, for example, like political studies, or they're in a commerce program if they want to do corporate law, or they do, like criminal justice sort of studies or forensics or something like that for undergrad. But the topic doesn't really actually matter that much. It's more the skills that you acquire in undergrad that I think are really helpful for law school. So for English, like a lot of law school is a lot of reading and a lot of dissecting information and a lot of writing and sort of diluting information after reading a lot. And so I was one of the only people that I knew whose reading list went down in law school. Like I was just used to having to read a lot. And for some other people who had taken other types of programs, that was kind of a shock. And so for me, just sort of the research skills and the analytical abilities and the writing skills that are really prominent in an English program, I thought actually were really helpful for preparing for law school.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Like after all these sessions I have with lawyers, many of them talk about the skills that we learn in our undergraduates being more important than the actual program. So it's nice to see that, like, you also agree with that. And I can completely see how it's probably very interesting to have your reading go down when you go into law school, because everyone talks about all the cases you have to read and files you have to learn in law school. And for you to say that your reading goes down, that's really interesting. Yeah, and just like a little question I wanted to ask. You mentioned that you didn't really think about applying to law school, just law school in general, and you're applying to your undergraduate. What made you decide to like pursue law school during your journey there?
I don't really have a good reason for that, unfortunately. A lot of people have this like, really exciting story about something that happened that inspired them to turn to the law. I don't. I just didn't know what else I was going to do. It was sort of in the back of my mind that I was going to maybe apply, but it wasn't. I don't know. It wasn't like a lifelong passion of mine or something. Like I know some people feel really strongly about going to law school from day one. Although I was cleaning up my house and I did just find an article I wrote when I was 12 years old saying that I was going to be a famous criminal defense lawyer 25 years down the road. So maybe it was something that I really had strong ambitions toward doing when I was a kid. I don't know. But I can tell you when I was in undergrad, it was on my radar for sure as something to do, but I wasn't one of these people who was like, doing pre-law stuff or whatever throughout undergrad. I was thinking that I wanted to be a speech language pathologist instead. So I was taking a bunch of classes to prepare for that. But then I ended up volunteering in that area and it just wasn't really for me. And so I kind of just, I don't know, I felt a bit lost and I wasn't really sure exactly what I was going to do, but I felt like I had to do something. And so I ended up studying for the LSAT and one thing just led to the next. And I ended up in law school.
I mean, that's great to hear. It seems like 12-year-old you manifested your future career. That's so funny. I love that. That's so funny. But yeah, so I mean, going into law school, obviously that's a whole nother step in your journey towards your career now. And I understand you went to Western for your JD.
Yeah.
But before we talk about your experience, could you talk about your process to applying? Like you said, you mentioned you took the LSAT just kind of out of the blue. So how was taking that LSAT and the overall process and application process for Western University for your JD?
Yeah. So sorry, to be clear, I don't think I took the LSAT out of the blue. I studied like a lot. So my process for applying to law school was actually quite grueling. I sort of made the decision, I guess, to go just because I felt like I didn't really know what else to do. But once I made that decision, I was pretty committed. And so a lot of people sort of, I don't know, it seems like they kind of just breeze into law school. Like a lot of the people, once you get there, it's like, oh, they had a great LSAT score, great grades, and everyone's spectacular. I'm here to tell you that it's a struggle for some of us. Like I wrote the LSAT 3 times. I did every prep course that was out there. I hired a private tutor from Harvard, like thinking that was going to somehow be helpful. I just was not good at the LSAT. I was really struggling, having a really hard time getting a decent score. So I studied for, I don't know, I think I started prep in third year. I studied for like a year and a half, honestly, and I took the test, like I said, 3 times without much difference. Frankly, my score didn't really improve that significantly. So it was hard. It was a really hard process for me. But I think the LSAT is one of those tests that some people take to and others just don't. Like I have friends who started studying 2 weeks before the test and went in and aced it. And some people just have that analytical brain and they're really good at those types of exams. That wasn't me. And so it's one of those tests where I recommend just taking a practice exam, somewhat early on, just to get a sense of how you take to it. Because if you're like me and it's going to be a slog, you might want to start putting some time in to studying for it. But if you find it's easier, then you can cut yourself some slack.
Yeah, no, and thank you for correcting me. I didn't mean for it to come out like you did it.
Oh, no. I just mean to say, like, I don't want to give the impression that I just like went willy-nilly, like it's for some people that test is actually really hard. And that's the way it was for me, for sure.
Yeah, no, a lot of the experiences are like discussed a lot just because it's not like the very ideal, like, oh yeah, I passed the LSAT on my first try. But it's really amazing to hear that you did it 3 times and you're like determined to just go through with it. And like clearly like it worked out for you in the end. So you are a successful lawyer and talking with us, pre-law students, giving your whole experience. Like I'm very thankful for that. So thank you for sharing with that, like, entire experience. But to continue on your application process. So what made you decide to go to Western Law?
Sure. So again, I just got into Western Law. I didn't get in really anywhere else. And so that's why I ended up there. I wish I had this sort of glamorous story that I was like the top of every school's list, but I think these things are important to talk about just because I think not everybody's journey is the same. And I hate sort of, having this picture painted like everything's a win and everything's a success. And so sometimes the law school process and sort of the rejection that comes with that and the struggles that come with applying to law school, it can be really hard. And so I'm here to tell you that if you don't get into every single school you apply to, things aren't over. You can still go on to have a really great, happy, and fulfilling career. I know I certainly have that now. And that I went to Western because frankly, that was the only school that I wasn't on a wait list for by the time it came time to pick. And so I ended up there just because I applied and because I got in.
No, thank you for sharing your experience. Like I said before, like it's really like you said, it's really important to talk about all these different experiences. Like sometimes like it's very like fantasy, like hearing about people say like, yeah, I got accepted into the school of my dreams. I got into like this glamorous ideal journey. But like I said, we're here to learn about every experience so that we know and we're prepared as pre-law students. So thank you for sharing with us.
No problem.
So, you still got into Western, which is still amazing. So congrats.
Oh yeah,
on that.
Western was great. I certainly love that school. Yeah, it was a really great learning experience. It was just far from my house. Like so I went to Queens for undergrad, as you know, and so that sort of I grew up sort of in that area, and so the prospect of sort of traveling all the way to Western was a little bit daunting for me, but I made it.
Yeah, exactly. You made it. That's all that matters in the end. Like you did it, and you're successful. So, like you said, you loved your law school. So how was your experience at law school? And what was it like transitioning from undergrad to law school? And did you face any difficulties throughout your law school years? And how did you overcome them? Sorry if those are lots of questions. Like if you need me to like say them again, just let me know and I'll just ask you them again.
Yeah, sure. So law school is just really hard, right? Like law school is really different than undergrad. There's a lot of people I find who come from programs that were pretty straightforward and they're used to getting straight A's and their grades are really good, obviously, because they got into law school, but then they get to law school and they find the schedule is a lot more demanding. The work that's involved is a lot more demanding. The grades are on a curve. So what that means is that most people are going to be getting B's and a lot of people aren't used to getting B's, and that can be a really tough pill to swallow. There's also a ton of extracurriculars that you can get involved in, and there's lots of stuff that you can do both inside and outside of school. And so the temptation to sort of take on too much, I think, is sort of there. So it can be sort of a struggle just to balance everything. And that's also, so when I went to law school, I was straight out of undergrad. I went right away, but there's other people who have other commitments as well, right? There's people who have kids, there's people who have families, there's people who are working jobs full-time or part-time when they're in law school. And so sometimes it can be really difficult, I think, for people to juggle all of those commitments. For me, fortunately, I wasn't working and I was able to just kind of focus on school and just focus on what I was doing. And so that was great. It was really hard, frankly. Like law school is just not a walk in the park. I think it's something that takes a lot of getting used to, and just in terms of the work volume and what's expected of you in terms of your courses. And so I guess law school is just really hard. I guess that's just like the best way to sum it up. There's a lot of pressure to do well, particularly in your first year, just because I find a lot of law schools, the way the process works is most law schools kind of tend to funnel people along a particular path, just because certain employers tend to start recruiting for jobs fairly early. And so there can be kind of an overwhelming pressure in your first year to try and excel in terms of your grades. Not everybody gets those jobs, and not everybody does well in their first year, and that's not the end of the world. But the sort of pressure that you feel, I think, can sometimes be overwhelming. And so anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but hopefully that somewhat answers your question.
No, you weren't rambling. Like, I really appreciate everything you're saying. Like, you're very honest and open about all your answers and your advice. And I mean, it's amazing that we have these conversations now, because like, you're putting it in words that we need to understand. Like, law school is hard. Like, obviously we work hard to get there, and it's not going to be an easy ride afterwards. But yeah, I mean, you talked about all these difficulties you were facing, how law school is really hard. How did you personally overcome like any challenges or difficulties you faced during these years?
Yeah, so I think just one step at a time. I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. Some days are just really overwhelming and really hard, and you just kind of got to push through. I just tried to keep it in mind that I've been through hard times before. Like, I've done other hard things, and I can do this hard thing as well. So you can get through this exam or this exam period or this or that, and you can persevere if that's what you want, right? So you just have to make a commitment to yourself, I think, at the outset, and decide, okay, what path do I want to go down? Because there's different paths that you can choose, and some might have requirements that others don't. So if you're committed to working at a Bay Street law firm, and you know that you need exceptional grades in your first year, well, maybe that's something that you want to put a lot of emphasis on. Maybe you want to make sure you're studying as much as you possibly can. But if you're doing something a little bit different, maybe you want to pursue a career in criminal defense, for example, like I'm doing now. Well, maybe you want to diversify a little bit, and maybe you want to spend some time doing some clinic work, or maybe you want to spend some time volunteering with a local law firm to try and get a sense of whether that's going to be right for you, and to try and get some experience. So I think just trying to figure out what your priorities are and directing your energy accordingly can be really helpful.
Thank you for that answer. And you did mention, like, how you some volunteering and some extracurriculars that we could do, which is a good segue into my next question. I noticed that you did a lot of extracurriculars during your time at law school, such as being a volunteer judge for the Jessup International Law Moot Court competition, and so much more. Could you elaborate more on your extracurricular experience and how you came to find these different extracurriculars?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I feel like I actually didn't do that many extracurriculars in comparison to some of the resumes I see at my firm nowadays. Like, I feel like applicants now are just, they're doing this clinic and that moot and this, president of this organization and that organization. That certainly wasn't me. My main thing in law school was I knew I wanted to be a litigator. I knew I was probably going to be on a career path towards being in court. And so I wanted to do all of the law competitions, anything that would get me on my feet, and anything that would get me sort of in court, so to speak, or sort of practicing. And so that's what I did. I did all the moots, any moot that I could sign up for, any law competition. And just in case no one's familiar with that term, I sort of take that for granted. But a moot is essentially a law competition where you're assigned a certain side of a case, and then you argue it out sort of amongst each other. It's like usually like a mock appeal where you're arguing about legal issues, but you can also have a mock trial where you're making legal submissions or practicing cross-examination or something like that. And so I signed up for as many of those as I could, just because I found them really valuable, not just as a litigation opportunity, but also as a networking opportunity, frankly, because usually those competitions are sponsored by various law firms. And if you do well, then sometimes you can be invited to the firm, for a dinner or for some sort of outing or whatever. And so, or you go to the finals and there's sort of like a cocktail party or something. And so it's always a really good opportunity just to sort of meet various different lawyers and get to know people that you wouldn't know otherwise, and also upper year students as well who might have done the competition before you. So I just found it a really useful networking tool, but also a good tool for just sharpening your legal skills early on. In terms of the time commitment involved as well, I thought that was really helpful, just because usually you'd get a problem a week before or something, and then you would work it up, and then you would just go and run with the competition. It's not something that was like, necessarily this year-long thing where every week you're spending a bunch of time doing it, with some notable exceptions. I did one moot in particular that was about a 1.5 year commitment with regular sort of stuff every week, but that was sort of a specific international law competition that I signed up to do. But some of the smaller ones that don't necessarily carry that much involvement from a time perspective. So you can kind of like, I don't know, just get a lot of bang for your time, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah. Thank you for that answer. Yeah, I usually like lawyers, they talk about all the extracurricular activities, but like I barely like hear about the moot competition. So my next question was I was gonna ask you if you could explain what that competition was, but I mean, you're just so good at answering these questions that you just answered it before I could even ask. Yeah, so
Sorry, you wanted to know what that law competition was about?
yeah, I mean, you gave us a brief answer about it already, but if you have more to elaborate, that'd be really great.
Oh yeah, sure. So most law schools have sort of more intense moot competition. So it's something that you do for credit. And so there's some that you can kind of do on the side as an extracurricular, but there's most of the time you can apply for or volunteer for or whatever the process is at your school to participate in a moot that's a little bit more substantial, and you spend a lot of time preparing, and it's a for credit activity. So I did what's called the Jessup Law Moot. It was an international law moot, and so it international in the sense that you can compete against schools internationally, but also the subject matter of the moot was international law. So dealing with matters before the International Court of Justice. And so that was the topic, and it was a pretty significant time commitment. It's something we had to apply for, I think, in first year at my school. And so it was this whole application process with interviews and everything else. And some moots are like that. They're a little bit more labor intensive to like get into the moot. Others you just sign up for and it's first come, first serve. So it just depends on the moot and depends on your school, but it requires you to work in a team, usually of 4 or 5 people, and prepare legal submissions and then compete against other law schools across the country and then hopefully internationally if you're successful. So I really enjoyed that experience.
Yeah, I mean, could you like talk about one moot that you had that like you think stood out against all the other ones that you think really helped you in your career?
Yeah, definitely that one. That was by far the most significant time commitment. That was by far the most significant thing at all I did in law school, actually, because it involved, I think we did 50 formally judged practice sessions. And each practice session, we would bring in judges from across the legal community. We would bring in real judges to practice judge us. And we had to know our submissions just like the back of our hand. And we had to know, we just really had to internalize a lot of knowledge just because it was a really competitive moot. And so just the amount of time and effort we spent into preparing and the amount of sort of teamwork that I think went into supporting each other while we were on this grueling schedule, in addition to all of our classes, it was really hard, but it was also really rewarding.
Yeah, no, it sounds like a lot of hard work, but I feel like it's like you said, like really rewarding. So like I don't know, it's making me excited to go to law school, just go to one of these moots.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to move on to the next question. And I understand that you're currently an associate at Daniel Brown Law, practicing as a criminal defense lawyer. Congrats on that. That's awesome. You know, criminal defense lawyer, like I understand, is really like, it's a lot of hard work. Sometimes I can understand it's like really mentally like grilling on you. So could you explain like why you specifically chose to pursue criminal defense and why, you know, like how did you become like an associate at Daniel Brown Law?
Yeah, so my path to criminal law was a little bit unusual, I suppose. Like it's not something that I knew my entire life I was gonna do. It wasn't something that I prepped doing in law school. I took no criminal law courses at all. But my path sort of just slowly narrowed until the point where I felt like I just had to pursue this area. So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And so I ended up doing what most people do, which is apply for a Bay Street job, just because there's good job security. It's kind of what everybody else is doing. It's kind of like, okay, well, I might as well do this for now and see how that goes. So I got a summer job at a big Bay Street firm and I articled there. And it just wasn't really for me. It was corporate commercial law. Again, I still knew I probably wanted to be a litigator. I wanted to be in court. I certainly didn't want to be doing corporate law, but sort of the nature of the work didn't really appeal to me. So I ended up applying to do a clerkship, which is essentially an opportunity to work at a court with a judge or a group of judges, depending on the court that you're at. So I clerked at the Court of Appeal for Ontario, where I clerked for 4 judges at different times throughout my year there. And about 50% of the Court of Appeal for Ontario's sitting list is criminal law. So I had a lot of exposure to criminal matters while I was there, which was really great. And that sort of got me, I guess, a bit more academically interested in criminal law, because you're not really seeing it from a client facing perspective. You're seeing it from a, court facing perspective. And so, and from a development of the law perspective, and all those cases were always the most interesting, but I still didn't know necessarily, okay, well, would this be for me? So after that, I ended up working at a litigation boutique here in Toronto that sort of dabbled in a variety of different things. So it was primarily corporate commercial, but they still did some criminal law. So I was able to sort of dabble a little bit just to see if that was something that I might like. And ultimately I decided, a lot of people who become criminal lawyers, I find they say the same thing. It's like, you kind of just fall in love with it, and you just suddenly one day realize, like, I just can't do anything else. I can't focus on any of my other files. It's this or best for me. You just really get invested in the client. You really get invested in the law. And then from there, my dog. And then from there, I decided to make the jump to go to Daniel Brown Law, where I'm currently working.
Yeah, that's amazing. Congrats on that. I mean, I think if it wasn't for that clerkship with the judges, you probably would have had a whole different career path, right?
Absolutely.
It is what exposed you to criminal law. So could you explain how you got that clerkship, or how you came about to finding it?
Yeah, so it actually wasn't really something that was discussed prominently at my law school, which is a shame. So a lot of schools really prioritize clerkships. And a lot of law schools really emphasize that as being a good opportunity. U of T in particular, a lot of students come from the University of Toronto and go into clerkship positions. And so how did I come to learn about it? I think someone ahead of me, actually, who did the move that I did a year ahead of me, ended up getting a clerkship position. That's how it kind of became on my radar. And so I started thinking about it a bit more. Usually the courts will come to law schools and they'll put on information sessions, and they'll just talk a little bit about the program, how to apply, what it entails. And so I think I went to one of those. But back when I did it, I don't think that my school really emphasized it enough, just because it's such a fantastic opportunity. And now I think that so I went back a couple of years ago and I spoke to my law school about clerkship opportunities, and there was a room filled with 100 people there. So I was really glad, because when I went, I think there were 4 people who turned out for the clerkship seminar. So it really is something worth considering if you are interested in being a litigator, just because it's a fantastic opportunity that you're never going to have again. It's only something you can do right after law school. You can't just sort of break later on and go back and do that. And so it's really something I'd encourage people to look at.
Yeah, no, during this entire session, you're giving us really straightforward, specific advice, which I'm really loving, because throughout the other sessions, they give us the regular, I don't want to say regular, but they give us advice that we can understand, I guess, extracurricular networking. But I really like how you're giving us very realistic, or how to do. Feels like I'm not hosting a session, but rather a tutorial on how to be a successful criminal defense lawyer.
Oh, good. Well,
so
I'm glad
thank you for that. Yeah. So I mean, like I said before, being a criminal defense lawyer comes with all sorts of misconceptions based off of television shows and media. So what are some of these misconceptions that you face in your everyday life? And are there any truth to some of these I don't know, facts from television or media about being a criminal defense lawyer?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the question that I get most frequently is, as a woman, how do you defend people who are charged with sexual offenses, in terms of sort of stereotypes? I mean, I don't really know what the stereotype is, frankly, but that's a question that I get a lot, that I think is kind of an unfair question. And I think I say that for a few reasons. So first, I think it's an incredibly gendered question. The question's never answered or never asked of a man. It's always asked of female criminal defense lawyers. And the answer to that question is that we're doing our job. So if you're a doctor, you're not going in judging the people that you're treating. You are there because you have a job to do, and your job isn't to judge the moral decisions of other people. You're there to provide a service. And the presumption of innocence is something that's really not to be taken lightly. People are entitled to A, be presumed innocent, and B, they're entitled to receive meaningful legal advice, whether that legal advice is you're going to jail because you've committed a very serious crime that there's no defense for, or it's, let's work together and we're going to work together towards defending your innocence. And so it's not my job to judge my clients for what they've done or not done. And I think that as a person, there's lots of things, or as a feminist, there's lots of things that I think are inappropriate, or things that I think are, things that people could do better, for example. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what a person has done rises to a criminal standard. And I think those are completely different things. So whatever my own personal views might be about a societal issue or a systemic issue, that really doesn't necessarily come to bear on what my responsibilities are as a lawyer in representing somebody. And so I think that's a very problematic misconception, that, you can't be a feminist and be a criminal lawyer at the same time, because those two things are somehow, they somehow don't fit together. And I think that's completely untrue.
I mean, I completely agree. I think, the position you're in, it provides more it's better for feminism. Like the fact that, hey, you are a female criminal defense lawyer advocating for this, and you're doing things that are typically not seen or viewed as feminists, or whatever people like to misconstrue about it. But I believe the stance you're taking is very important, because here you're doing your job. It kind of just separates your responsibilities as a lawyer to who you are as a person. Sometimes people always assume that those things have to be intertwined, but exactly, like a doctor, they don't really have to, they don't judge their patients, they just do their job.
That's right.
Yeah. So like I said, criminal defense lawyers probably have a lot of things they must do. So what is a typical day in your career in terms of responsibilities and tasks?
Yeah, sure. So I think, a lot depends on what your practice is like. So I know a lot of criminal lawyers who are in court every day, most days. They're in court more days than not. That's sort of a traditional criminal law barrister. My practice isn't really like that. I can be in court, maybe a couple times a week on very, very minor things, but I usually have maybe 5 or 6 trials a year, just because the cases that we do tend to involve very significant preparation, and it's not something we can just kind of roll up and do. So the amount of time that I'm in court is perhaps a little bit less than some other criminal defense lawyers, but day to day, it really just depends. So today, for example, in the morning, one of my colleagues at my office was doing a trial that I've been sort of assisting in the background with. And so it was over Zoom. So I had the opportunity to phone in and sort of chat with her throughout that case about how that was going and sort of provide some feedback. Mentorship is really important at our firm. So all of us usually try and work together collaboratively on our cases. And if someone has a trial, usually someone else tries to be there just to kind of provide support and so on. So I did that. I did a consultation with a possible new client who was facing some serious criminal charges first thing this afternoon. And so I spent an hour of time doing that. And like any job, there's a lot of emails, a lot of sitting, just sitting at your desk or responding to correspondence and taking calls that might come through. I spend a lot of time preparing. I spend a lot of time writing. So I spend a lot of time preparing legal applications that require sort of extensive written submissions in support of what we're arguing. So there's often pretrial motions that go along with cases because you want to exclude certain evidence or you want to admit certain evidence. And so I spend a lot of time writing materials for those types of things. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. I didn't know that you only had like 4 to 6 cases. I was like prepared to say like, here you say like, yeah, like I go to like court like every day of the week, because that's usually what you expect from a criminal defense lawyer. But it's really interesting to like hear like a different perspective of that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I have a lot more than 3 or 4 cases on the go at any given time, but in terms of the number of actual trials and matters that are proceeding in court every year, I mean, I'm certainly not in court every single day.
Yeah.
But that's
And
my
like,
choice too, right? Like there's a lot of flexibility, I think, in terms of how you govern your practice and what you're doing. And so for me, like if I wanted to be in court more, I could be, but for me, this is sort of the balance that I've struck that works for me.
yeah, no, that's nice to hear. It's nice to hear a different perspective. And you mentioned that you're like having a consultation with a new client. So what is a typical client like at your firm?
Yeah, so we do, like I said, a lot of sexual offense cases. So we have, our firm has a particular expertise in this area, and me in particular, probably about 80% of my practice right now is sexual offenses. It's stuff that comes up a lot, and it's something that takes up a lot of time. These types of cases are increasingly complex, and the law is constantly changing in this area. And so it's actually very challenging to stay on top of exactly what's happening. And so I try my best to do that. And our firm, we're trying to be sort of, a leader in this particular area and staying on top of the law. So we do a lot of cases like that. That said, we tend to represent a lot of professionals who have a lot on the line. So we represent, lawyers, doctors, insurance brokers, realtors, et cetera. And it's not just criminal consequences, but they could lose their professional licenses. And there's a lot on the line for them in terms of their professional reputation. And so those are the sorts of cases that tend to come in the door. In terms of subject matter, there's no real limit. So I think I mentioned earlier last year, we were in court for 6 weeks doing a jury trial on a murder. We did a failure to remain causing death case. So usually cases that sort of have some significant complexity or level of severity to them.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And you mentioned that like your firm, like you like to stay on top of the laws and like any changes in the, policies that are made. And I know recently there was a new law that was introduced, or I don't know how to word it properly, but it was about how, your level of intoxication can be used as a defense in court. So how did that like affect your law firm, or like how did you go about it?
Yeah, so I mean, it didn't at all, just because that defense is so incredibly rare. And I think that case was reported on really poorly. And that was really unfortunate, because people walked away with this sort of clickbait headline, like intoxication is now a defense to sexual assault or violent offenses. And that's just not the case at all. And what that case did really was actually just strike down a provision of the criminal code that said, if you don't have the mental capacity to be able to form the criminal intent, which is a requisite part of committing a crime, then for some offenses, you might be able to avail yourself of this sort of, quote, intoxication defense. And what the case said is that that's going to happen. Like, I have never seen that happen. I have never advanced that defense on behalf of a client. And the reason for that is simple. It's because you have to be so intoxicated. Like, this isn't just going out to the bar and getting really wasted with your friends. This is like in every single case that was before the Supreme Court. In that case, it involved unexpected reactions to basically serious chemical drugs, and on top of consumption of alcohol, on top of. And so it's going to be an extremely exceptionally rare case that you would have to prove with expert evidence that a person was so incredibly intoxicated that they just couldn't possibly form the mental capacity to commit a particular offense. So in terms of how that impacted my practice, like, it just didn't at all, because none of my clients are in that situation, because it's so incredibly rare. But also, these are things you obviously want to stay on top of, right? Like, that was a big case, so we all make sure to talk about it and think about its implications.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great, like a good thing to do. And definitely the media definitely like misconstrued it. Like, I remember everyone posting about it saying, oh my God, like this is so disrespectful, this is so rude. But like, once you read the article, you realize like how important this policy is, and like how, like you said, like it didn't even affect your law firm. And the fact is, it's because it's not used often, which I think like, people need to understand that more instead of just seeing things for like face value on social media.
Right.
Oh, yeah. So I like to ask all the lawyers I host this question. So is there any case that stands out to you the most? Like if someone asked you about the craziest case you've ever dealt with, what's the first one that comes into your mind? And of course, if there's something that you can't talk about, you're obviously free to, like pass this question.
I mean, 100%. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily the craziest case I've dealt with, but the most significant for sure, hands down, is the murder trial that I did last year. We were representing a young man whose life was literally on the line. He was out on bail, so we were able to get to know him and work with him quite closely. And he was charged with a murder after someone died as a result of a shooting outside a nightclub. And he was just a really remarkable, wonderful person. And he was being wrongfully accused of this. And I knew that if we were unsuccessful, then his life was over and he was going to jail for life. And the pressure there was enormous. And the amount of responsibility that we had in defending him was really significant. And we were ultimately successful. And I got to be just like the moment when the jury comes back and says not guilty, they knew the whole thing was shocking, just the way it unfolded. The jury deliberated, I think, for less than 2 hours. And I mean, oftentimes juries deliberate for like days.
Yeah.
When it's only, a week or two long case. And this was a 6-week murder trial. And they came back basically immediately and found him not guilty. And that was probably, it was certainly the best moment of my my career to date, and probably one of the best moments just of my life, just in general. Getting that verdict, it still makes me emotional to think about, just because it had such a profound impact on this person who had no criminal record and, a young child at home and a spouse and everything else. And so that was really significant for me.
I know, just hearing you talk about it, like I can feel the emotion you have. Like I'm getting goosebumps. Like thank you for just being such a good representative of the criminal defense lawyers out there and just being a good protector of the criminal justice system. Like it's nice to hear that, like you helped some person who was wrongfully convicted of a crime that they obviously didn't commit. So, just, thank you for that. It's really nice to hear. I can definitely see how this impacted if that was me, I would definitely like say the exact same story. This seems like a life-changing moment for not only him, but for you as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm reaching my last question, and I believe it's one of the most important questions that we like to ask here at Pre-Law Chatterers, because like we said, we are a organization that is catered towards pre-law students, and pre-law students are often, aspiring legal professionals. So what advice would you give to the next future generation of aspiring legal professionals?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. So, I think two things. So first, try and just take it easy on yourself. It's a really long road and it's a really long career. And I think there's a temptation to go, immediately write the LSAT and immediately go to law school, but it's also fine to take a little bit of time. I was one of the only people, or at least in the minority of people at my law school who went directly from undergrad to law school. A lot of other people took time to travel or do a master's or work or whatever it is. And I think that's a really valuable opportunity because it gives you some life experience and it gives you some perspective. So if you don't get into law school right away, or if you decide you want to take a bit of a breather, I think there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a really long career and it's a long, stressful journey. So don't worry about what other people are doing. Just do you, because you'll thank yourself in the long run. The second thing is pay attention, I think, to what's interesting to you and try new things, because you don't want to end up in a career where you sort of look back 20 years from now and think like, oh, I kind of just ended up there. Like, do I even like what I'm doing? And sort of realize that you're unhappy. And I think law schools have a tendency to sort of funnel people towards a particular career path. It's corporate law or bust. You have to go to Bay Street or else, you know, you won't be successful and you won't be happy. And if that's for you, that's great. That's a fantastic opportunity and it's a fantastic path. But for some people, that's not necessarily the right path. And so I just encourage people to sort of evaluate critically what you want and the sort of areas of the law that might speak to you, even if it's something that not everybody at your law school is doing, and reach out to people who are in that area and take opportunities to learn more about it. Because again, I think you'll thank yourself later.
I mean, thank you. That was really, like, you know, very interesting, very insightful advice that you gave us. And yeah, like I said before, those are all my questions for today. So I'll open the floor up to Sarah. If you wanted to ask Lindsay any questions, you can raise your hand, type it in the chat, or unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I actually don't have any questions. Everything that you asked was, everything that I had in mind, but I did just want to say thank you so much, Lindsay, because everything you said was very valuable. And I'm at Western for my undergraduate, and I'm thinking about going there for law school. So everything you said about like how Western doesn't really prioritize or like really say things about like the clerkships and stuff like that is, it's just, oh, I am so sorry. But it's just very interesting. So if I do decide to go there, I know that like those options are available. So thank you so much.
That's great. I encourage you to reach out if you do go.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was a real honor.
No, thank you for like taking the time out of your busy schedule to come join us. Like, I would just like to thank you on behalf of all of the pre-law shadowers for taking the time. Like, I really appreciate all the advice you gave us. Like Sarah said, everything you said truly held very important significance. And it's something that I personally will like be thinking about when I'm going through my law school applications and I'm taking the LSAT. Like, I mean, I really did enjoy our conversation today, and everything you said was really important.
That's great. Well, I enjoyed speaking with you as well. Thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
So thank you. I hope you have a great rest of your day. If there's anything else you want to say, feel free to say so right now.
I think that's all. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.